October 23rd, 1944, in the German border town of Aachen. Lieutenant David Harrison climbs down from his Sherman tank and surveys the rubble-strewn streets that lead toward the city center. For 3 solid weeks, his tank company has been pushing relentlessly through German border defenses, and while the advance has proceeded more slowly than anticipated, the outcome feels absolutely inevitable. German industry appears to be collapsing under sustained pressure. Allied intelligence reports consistently show ammunition shortages, fuel shortages, and weapon production plummeting dramatically under round-the-clock bombing campaigns. The Wehrmacht is running critically low on everything, including the heavy anti-tank guns that have made armored warfare so costly and dangerous throughout the European campaign. Harrison's Sherman carries visible scars from 2 full years of combat across France and into the Low Countries. Patches of welded armor cover battle damage sustained from encounters with German 88mm guns and the occasional Panther or Tiger tank. But those encounters have become increasingly rare in recent weeks. The Tigers that terrorized Allied armor in Normandy are seldom seen now on the battlefield. German panzer divisions are mere shadows of their former strength and capability. Intelligence briefings consistently emphasize the deteriorating state of German armored forces. Fewer operational tanks, reduced crew training quality, declining spare parts availability. The message is unmistakably clear to every tank commander operating in the European theater. German anti-tank capability is diminishing steadily with each passing week. The Sherman tank represents American industrial supremacy in tangible, physical form. Each M4 costs approximately $50,000 to manufacture, a price that includes the Wright Continental engine, the 75mm main gun, the gyro stabilizer that allows firing while moving, the thick armor plate, and the complex transmission system. That $50,000 figure, multiplied by the tens of thousands of Shermans rolling continuously off production lines in Detroit and Chicago, represents the arithmetic of American industry applied directly to mechanized warfare. Harrison's company currently has 14 operational Shermans ready for combat. British Churchill tanks from the 7th Armored Division are positioned just 2 streets over. The combined Allied armored force preparing to push into central Aachen represents millions of dollars in military hardware, tanks, ammunition, fuel, radios, spare parts, all shipped across the Atlantic, transported through French ports, and assembled here on the German border for the final drive toward the Rhine. German defensive capabilities in late 1944 appear to be crumbling steadily under the weight of Allied material superiority. Luftwaffe aircraft rarely appear over the battlefield anymore. German artillery fire is sporadic and inconsistent compared to the sustained barrages of earlier campaigns. The Wehrmacht divisions defending Aachen are composed largely of replacement troops, older men, and hastily trained conscripts who lack the experience of veteran formations. Allied commanders expect resistance, certainly, but not the kind of organized, sophisticated defense that characterized German operations in France. The intelligence assessments paint a picture of an enemy running desperately short on everything except determination and willingness to fight. German tanks are scarce across the front. The feared 88mm anti-tank guns are being pulled back to defend strategic positions rather than deployed forward in mobile defense. Soviet offensives in the east are drawing German armor and heavy weapons away from the Western Front in alarming numbers. The calculus seems entirely straightforward to Allied planners. Allied tanks should be able to operate with relative freedom against an enemy whose anti-tank capabilities are degraded by attrition and severe resource depletion. Harrison briefs his tank commanders on the planned assault into Aachen's city center. The operation calls for armored spearheads supported closely by infantry to clear German positions systematically, block by block. These are standard combined arms tactics that have proven effective throughout the campaign across France. Tanks provide mobile firepower and protection for infantry advancing behind them. Infantry clears buildings methodically and protects tanks from close-range threats that armor cannot detect. The doctrine has worked consistently from Normandy to the German border. But something fundamental has changed in the character of German resistance over the past 2 weeks. Allied infantry units report encountering Volksgrenadier divisions equipped with weapons that seem inconsistent with intelligence assessments of German industrial collapse. New model assault rifles, substantial ammunition supplies, and disturbing reports of portable anti-tank weapons appearing in numbers that don't match the prevailing narrative of declining German capabilities. The reports describe a weapon system that seems almost improvised in its basic simplicity. German infantry carrying what appear to be simple metal tubes with crude firing mechanisms, single-shot devices that soldiers discard immediately after use. American infantry who have captured examples describe them as pipe-like launchers with minimal mechanical complexity, nothing like the sophisticated German anti-tank rifles and recoilless guns encountered earlier in the war. Tank crews hear these reports with skepticism mixed with appropriate caution. Improvised weapons are nothing new to the European battlefield. German troops have been using magnetic mines, shaped charges, and close assault tactics against tanks since 1939. But the scale seems different now, fundamentally different. The reports are coming from multiple sectors simultaneously. British armor units operating near Geilenkirchen report similar encounters. Canadian forces in the Netherlands describe German infantry attacking tanks with disposable tube weapons at ranges that seem suicidally close. Harrison examines a captured example brought back by infantry scouts earlier that morning. The weapon is shockingly simple in its construction. A metal tube approximately 1 meter long, a cylindrical warhead at the front end, a crude trigger mechanism, and no sights beyond basic iron notches. The entire device weighs perhaps 6 kilograms. It looks like something fabricated hastily in a workshop rather than manufactured in a precision factory. The construction quality is rough and unrefined. Welds are clearly visible. The metal shows no sophisticated finishing or treatment. This is not German engineering as Allied forces have come to expect it. Methodical, precise, over-engineered. The weapon is labeled Panzerfaust, tank fist. The name is appropriately blunt and descriptive. Intelligence officers examine it carefully and conclude it represents desperate German improvisation. A cheap stopgap measure to arm infantry with something resembling anti-tank capability when proper anti-tank guns are unavailable. The assessment seems entirely reasonable. Germany is running out of resources and manufacturing capacity. Manufacturing crude, disposable weapons makes perfect sense when you can no longer produce complex, recoilless rifles or towed anti-tank guns. What the intelligence officers do not yet understand is the weapon's actual effectiveness in combat. The Panzerfaust is not a desperate improvisation born of weakness. It is a revolutionary shift in anti-tank warfare economics. The device costs 30 Reichsmarks to manufacture, 30 Reichsmarks for a weapon that can destroy a $50,000 tank. The shaped charge warhead can penetrate 200 millimeters of armor at 30 meters range. That penetration capability exceeds the Sherman's frontal armor thickness significantly. It exceeds the Churchill's side armor. It makes the Panzerfaust capable of destroying any Allied tank in the European theater if fired from sufficiently close range. But Harrison and his tank commanders do not yet know these specifications. They know only that German infantry are carrying tube weapons that intelligence dismisses as improvised and probably ineffective. The emphasis in planning documents remains on traditional anti-tank threats: German tanks, towed guns, mines. The Panzerfaust appears in intelligence summaries as a footnote, a curiosity, not a primary threat to armored operations. The assault into Aachen begins at dawn the following morning. Harrison's Sherman Company leads the advance down Wilhelmstrasse toward the city center. Infantry from the 1st Infantry Division follows closely behind the tanks. The doctrine is textbook combined arms warfare. Tanks advance, infantry clears buildings systematically. German resistance is expected to be moderate, given the apparent collapse of Wehrmacht defensive capabilities across the sector. The street is narrow and confined. Buildings rise 3 and 4 stories on both sides. Rubble from previous artillery bombardment partially blocks the avenue at several points. Harrison's tank navigates carefully around a destroyed German truck. The turret traverses left and right as the gunner scans for targets. Radio chatter indicates other tank platoons are making similar progress on parallel streets. Resistance so far has been limited to sporadic rifle fire and the occasional Panzerfaust round that detonates harmlessly against building walls. Harrison feels the familiar tension of urban combat, but also the confidence born from months of successful operations. The Sherman beneath him has survived 2 years of war. His crew is experienced and professional. German defenders are supposed to be running low on everything, including morale. The advance should continue to the city center by afternoon. The lead tank in Harrison's column reaches an intersection when the first Panzerfaust impacts. The explosion sounds different from artillery or mortar fire. A sharp crack, followed by the shriek of metal tearing. The lead Sherman lurches to a halt as smoke pours from its engine compartment. The crew bails out through hatches before secondary explosions begin. Harrison watches through his periscope as the tank commander and gunner drop to the street and sprint toward cover. The loader stumbles out last, moving awkwardly. All 3 men make it to a doorway before German small arms fire forces them to take cover. Harrison cannot identify where the shot originated from. No muzzle flash visible, no smoke trail visible in the rubble-choked intersection. The disabled Sherman burns in the middle of the street, effectively blocking the advance route. Infantry moving behind Harrison's tank takes cover in building entrances and begins returning fire at unseen targets. Radio traffic increases dramatically as platoon leaders try to coordinate a response to contact from unknown positions. The second Panzerfaust fires from a 3rd-story window 40 meters to the right. Harrison sees the brief flash this time. A German soldier visible for perhaps 2 seconds in the window frame. The warhead crosses the distance to the second Sherman in Harrison's column almost instantaneously. The shaped charge jet punches through the tank's side armor and detonates the ammunition stored in the sponson. The explosion is catastrophic and immediate. The turret lifts several inches before settling back askew on the hull. Flames erupt from every hatch. Harrison orders his driver to reverse immediately. The Sherman backs 20 meters down Wilhelmstrasse, while the turret traverses toward the building where the second shot originated. The gunner fires a high explosive shell into the third-story window. The blast collapses part of the building facade, but Harrison has no way to confirm whether the German soldier who fired is killed or simply relocated to another firing position. 2 Shermans disabled in less than 3 minutes of combat. Harrison's training and experience suggest mines or a concealed anti-tank gun, but the trajectories are wrong for mines. The damage patterns are wrong. Both tanks were hit from elevated positions at close range with weapons that produced minimal signature and maximum effect. This matches the infantry reports about Panzerfausts, but Harrison's understanding of the weapon's capabilities comes from intelligence summaries that describe them as improvised and marginally effective. The reality confronting Harrison's tank company contradicts those assessments completely. 2 $50,000 tanks destroyed by weapons that apparently cost less than a case of American cigarettes. The economic disparity is staggering, but irrelevant to the immediate tactical problem. Harrison needs to advance through a street flanked by multi-story buildings where German infantry can fire these weapons from positions that tanks cannot effectively engage. Infantry from the 1st Division begins clearing buildings systematically on both sides of Wilhelmstrasse. This is the doctrinal response to close-range anti-tank threats. Infantry protects the armor by eliminating enemy infantry positions before tanks advance into their engagement range. But the building clearing process is slow and dangerous. Each room must be checked, each stairwell secured. The German defenders are fighting from prepared positions with clear sightlines to the street. A 3rd Panzerfaust fires from ground level a basement window that Harrison's crew never identified as a threat position. The warhead hits Harrison's Sherman on the lower glacis plate where the armor is thinnest. The penetration is clean and devastating. The shaped charge jet enters the crew compartment and kills the bow gunner instantly. The driver screams into the intercom that the transmission is hit. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the interior. Harrison orders immediate evacuation. The crew abandons the Sherman in under 20 seconds. Harrison is the last out through the turret hatch. He drops to the street and runs toward the nearest building entrance while German machine gun fire kicks up concrete fragments around his boots. His gunner and loader are already inside the building. The driver is helping the wounded bow gunner toward cover. Harrison reaches the doorway and pulls both men inside as bullets stitch the wall above their heads. 3 tanks destroyed, 3 more damaged and withdrawn from the immediate combat zone. Harrison's company has lost nearly half its effective strength in less than 15 minutes of urban combat. The advance has stalled completely. Infantry units are fully engaged clearing buildings and cannot provide the protection that armored forces require. The tactical situation has deteriorated from a confident advance into a chaotic close-quarters battle where the primary threat comes from weapons that Allied intelligence characterized as improvised and ineffective. Harrison watches from the building entrance as another Sherman attempts to maneuver around the burning wrecks blocking Wilhelmstrasse. The tank makes it perhaps 30 meters before a Panzerfaust impacts its right track. The explosion severs the track and immobilizes the tank in the middle of the street. The crew does not wait to assess damage. They evacuate immediately because every tank commander in Harrison's company now understands that a disabled tank in an urban environment is a death trap. German infantry will close on the immobilized vehicle and destroy it with additional Panzerfausts or grenades. British Churchill tanks operating 2 streets over report similar encounters. Multiple tanks disabled by German infantry using what appears to be the same disposable tube weapon. Canadian armored units in the Netherlands send radio messages describing identical tactical problems. The pattern is emerging across the entire Western Front. German infantry equipped with cheap-shaped charge weapons are destroying Allied tanks at rates that make armored advances into urban terrain prohibitively costly. The weapon's simplicity makes it devastatingly effective in close-quarters combat. A German Volksgrenadier requires minimal training to operate the Panzerfaust. Point the tube at the tank, remove the safety pin, press the trigger. The weapon fires automatically, and the soldier discards the empty tube. Total engagement time from target acquisition to firing is under 5 seconds. The effective range is 30 meters or less, but in urban terrain, that limitation is irrelevant. Buildings provide concealment until tanks are well within engagement range. Harrison's gunner provides a detailed description of the basement window attack. The German soldier appeared in the window opening for perhaps 3 seconds, fired the Panzerfaust, and disappeared back into the basement before the gunner could traverse the turret and return fire. The entire engagement lasted less time than it takes to identify and engage a conventional anti-tank gun position. Tank crews trained to fight at ranges of 500 to 1, 500 meters against other tanks or towed guns are discovering that their primary threat in urban combat comes from infantry soldiers appearing suddenly at ranges of 20 to 40 meters. The shaped charge warhead technology makes armor thickness largely irrelevant at these close ranges. Sherman frontal armor is approximately 76 millimeters thick. The Panzerfaust can penetrate 200 millimeters. British Churchill tanks with heavier armor protection fare no better. The physics of shaped charge penetration favor the attacker at close range, regardless of defensive armor thickness. A .30 Reichsmark weapon wielded by a minimally trained soldier can destroy a tank that represents 2 years of American industrial output and $50,000 in manufacturing costs. American infantry clearing buildings in Aachen begin finding Panzerfaust launchers in almost every German defensive position: basements, upper floors, rubble-filled rooms. Wherever German troops established fighting positions, they positioned Panzerfausts for anti-armor defense. The weapons are so cheap and simple to produce that German forces appear to have an effectively unlimited supply. Captured German soldiers report that Volksgrenadier companies received dozens of Panzerfausts as standard issue. Some units have more Panzerfausts than rifles. Harrison reorganizes his surviving tanks and coordinates with infantry commanders on new approach tactics. The standard doctrine of armored spearheads is clearly failing. Tanks cannot advance through urban terrain without overwhelming infantry support to clear every building, every basement, every window that might conceal a Panzerfaust position. but providing that level of infantry support slows the advance to a crawl and exposes infantry to heavy casualties from German defensive fires. The tactical problem has no easy solution. Allied armored forces entered Aachen expecting to face a weakened enemy with declining anti-tank capabilities. Instead, they encountered a weapons system that inverted the economic and tactical calculus of armored warfare. Expensive tanks destroyed by cheap, disposable weapons. Well-trained tank crews vulnerable to minimally trained infantry. American industrial superiority negated by German ingenuity in weapon design and mass production of simple but effective shaped charge launchers. Harrison watches as recovery vehicles attempt to tow the disabled Shermans back from the combat zone. 2 tanks are total losses, still burning in the intersection. 1 tank might be repairable if it can be recovered without further damage. The human cost is lighter than it might have been. Most crews escaped before their tanks were completely destroyed, but the material cost is staggering. 7 tanks representing $350,000 in American industrial output eliminated by weapons that probably cost less than 300 Reichsmarks total. The advance into Aachen continues, but the pace changes fundamentally. Tank companies now refuse to operate in urban terrain without extensive infantry support. Infantry commanders demand artillery preparation before clearing operations. The entire tactical tempo slows as Allied forces adapt to a threat that intelligence summaries never adequately warned them about. Within 48 hours of Harrison's encounter in Aachen, after-action reports from 6 different armored divisions compile similar patterns. British XXX Corps operating near Geilenkirchen loses 23 tanks in 3 days to Panzerfaust attacks. Canadian armored units in the Scheldt estuary report 18 tanks disabled by the weapons in a single afternoon of urban combat. American 2nd Armored Division, documenting operations near Eschweiler, counts 31 tank losses attributed to close-range shaped charge weapons in 1 week of fighting. The numbers force a reassessment at headquarters level. Intelligence officers who initially dismissed the Panzerfaust as improvised desperation equipment begin analyzing the weapon's actual capabilities and production scale carefully. German prisoners provide information that contradicts every assumption Allied planners made about declining Wehrmacht anti-tank capacity. The Panzerfaust is not a stopgap measure. It is a deliberately engineered weapon system designed for mass production and distributed to German forces in quantities that exceed the distribution of any other infantry anti-tank weapon in military history. Captain Robert Hayes at 1st Army Intelligence Headquarters receives his 5th Panzerfaust sample in 2 weeks. Each example shows identical construction, same tube diameter, same warhead design, same trigger mechanism. The consistency indicates factory production rather than field improvisation. Hayes disassembles the weapon and discovers engineering choices that prioritize manufacturing simplicity over performance refinement. Stamped metal components instead of machine parts. Welded construction instead of precision fitting. A firing mechanism with only 3 moving parts. The cost analysis shocks Allied intelligence when German factory records captured near Düren provide actual production figures. Each Panzerfaust costs 30 Reichsmarks to manufacture. The exchange rate is uncertain in late 1944, but 30 Reichsmarks represents approximately $12 in equivalent purchasing power. $12 for a weapon that can destroy a $50,000 tank. The cost ratio is 4,000 to 1 in favor of the defender. Hayes calculates the strategic implications carefully. If Germany can produce Panzerfausts at $12 each and distribute them in sufficient quantities to equip every infantry squad, the Wehrmacht can destroy Allied armor at a fraction of the cost required to replace those tanks. American factories must manufacture, ship, and deliver replacement Shermans across the Atlantic at costs exceeding $50,000 per vehicle. German factories can produce anti-tank weapons capable of destroying those Shermans for less than the cost of a week's rations for a single soldier. The production numbers emerging from captured documents are staggering. German industry manufactured approximately 100,000 Panzerfausts in 1943, when the weapon was still being refined and production scaled up. Production in 1944 reaches nearly 2 million units. Intelligence estimates for 1945 suggest German factories are capable of producing 4 million Panzerfausts annually if raw materials remain available. The total production over the weapon's operational lifespan may exceed 6 million units. 6 million disposable anti-tank weapons distributed across German defensive positions from the Rhine to the Otter River. Allied armored forces are advancing into a defensive environment where every German infantry squad potentially possesses multiple tank-killing weapons that cost less than a carton of American cigarettes. The strategic calculation that assumed declining German anti-tank capability was based on Wehrmacht tank losses and reduced production of heavy anti-tank guns. No one at Allied headquarters anticipated that Germany would compensate for fewer tanks and guns by equipping every infantry soldier with a weapon capable of destroying Allied armor at point-blank range. Tank crews throughout the European theater begin requesting operational modifications based on combat experience with Panzerfausts. Crews weld spare track links and sandbags onto hull armor to provide standoff distance. For shaped charge warheads, tank commanders insist on infantry support before entering any urban terrain or confined approach routes. Some units experiment with pre-battle reconnaissance to identify potential Panzerfaust positions and suppress them with artillery before armor advances. But the fundamental tactical problem has no complete solution. Urban combat requires tanks to operate in environments where German infantry can approach within 30 meters before being detected. Forests and villages provide similar concealment. River crossings force tanks into predictable routes where Panzerfaust teams can prepare ambush positions. Every restricted terrain feature becomes a potential killing zone for Allied armor facing an enemy equipped with weapons specifically designed to exploit those tactical constraints. The psychological impact on tank crews equals the material losses. Soldiers who survived months of combat against German 88mm guns and Panther tanks understood those threats operated at ranges where they could be identified and engaged. A Sherman crew could see an 88mm gun position at 800 meters and maneuver to avoid its fire or suppress it with artillery. German Panthers were visible at similar ranges and could be countered with numerical superiority or air support. The Panzerfaust operates at ranges where detection and response are nearly impossible. A German soldier appears in a basement window 30 meters away, fires, and disappears. Total engagement time under 5 seconds. The tank crew has no opportunity to identify the threat, traverse the turret, and return fire before the shaped charge warhead penetrates their armor. Crews describe the experience as fighting an invisible enemy who can kill them from positions they cannot see until the moment of impact. Lieutenant Harrison returns to his company after 3 days of reorganization and receives 7 replacement Shermans to restore unit strength. The new tanks arrive with improvised armor modifications already installed, spare track welded to hull sides, sandbags packed around ammunition storage, additional armor plate protecting the lower glacis. The modifications add weight and reduce mobility. But tank crews insist on any measure that might provide additional protection against Panzerfaust attacks. Harrison briefs his replacement tank commanders on lessons learned from the Aachen fighting. Never advance through urban terrain without infantry clearing buildings ahead of the armor. Never enter narrow streets where tanks cannot maneuver away from close-range threats. Never assume a building is clear just because it appears abandoned. German Volksgrenadier units position Panzerfaust teams in basements, upper floors, and rubble piles specifically to ambush tanks that advance without adequate infantry support. The tactical adaptations slow Allied operations significantly. Advances that might have taken hours now require days as infantry methodically clears every potential Panzerfaust position. Artillery expenditure increases as commanders order preparatory bombardments on any terrain feature that might conceal anti-tank teams. Casualty rates among infantry rise because they must expose themselves to German defensive fires while clearing positions to protect armor from close-range attacks. Allied air forces attempt to locate and destroy German Panzerfaust stockpiles, but the weapons are too small and too widely distributed to make aerial interdiction effective. German logistics disperses Panzerfausts in small caches throughout defensive positions rather than concentrating them in vulnerable depots. Fighter bombers can destroy German tanks and artillery positions, but cannot eliminate weapons that individual soldiers carry into battle and hide in rubble until needed. British intelligence interrogates captured German soldiers about Panzerfaust training and distribution. The responses confirm Allied fears. Every Volksgrenadier receives basic instruction in Panzerfaust employment: how to arm the weapon, estimate range, aim at vulnerable points on enemy tanks, and evade after firing. Training time is minimal because the weapon requires minimal skill to operate effectively. Point the tube at the tank. Get within 30 meters. Fire. The simplicity makes it possible to train replacement troops in hours, rather than the weeks or months required to develop proficiency with conventional anti-tank guns. German prisoners describe receiving 6 to 8 Panzerfausts per squad as standard issue in late 1944. Some elite units receive more. Fallschirmjäger and SS divisions report having unlimited access to the weapons. One captured Obergefreiter from a Volksgrenadier division states his company maintained a stockpile of over 200 Panzerfausts in basement positions throughout their defensive sector. When one firing position was suppressed by Allied artillery, soldiers simply retrieved additional weapons from the stockpile and re-established the position. The economic implications crystallize in late November when Allied logistics officers calculate replacement costs for tanks lost to Panzerfaust attacks. September through November 1944, tank losses to all causes exceed 1,200 vehicles across the Western Front. Intelligence estimates approximately 40% of those losses resulted from Panzerfaust attacks rather than German tanks, anti-tank guns, or mines. 480 tanks destroyed by weapons costing roughly $12 each. 480 tanks at $50,000 per vehicle equals $24 million in American manufacturing costs. Destroyed by weapons costing approximately $5,760 total. The cost-exchange ratio approaches 4,000 to 1 in Germany's favor. Allied industrial capacity can absorb those losses, but the arithmetic reveals how a technologically inferior power can impose disproportionate costs on a superior opponent through innovative weapon design and mass production. Harrison's tank company reaches the Roer River in early December after 6 weeks of continuous operations from Aachen. His unit has received 21 replacement tanks during that period. 14 of those replacements were necessary because of Panzerfaust attacks. Harrison himself has survived 3 separate encounters where German infantry fired the weapons at his tank from ranges under 40 meters. 2 shots missed, 1 hit the turret at an angle that caused the warhead to deflect without penetrating. Harrison's survival is partially luck and partially the result of tactical adaptations his crews developed through bitter experience. His tanks now advance in mutually supporting pairs with infantry scouts moving 50 meters ahead of the armor. When infantry identifies potential Panzerfaust positions, the lead tank suppresses them with machine gun fire, while the second tank engages with high explosive shells. The technique works, but requires constant coordination between armor and infantry, and slows advance rates to less than 1 kilometer per hour in contested urban terrain. The realization spreading through Allied armored forces is uncomfortable but undeniable. German industry on the verge of collapse has produced a weapon that fundamentally altered the tactical balance of armored warfare, not through superior technology or engineering excellence, but through ruthless simplification and mass production. The Panzerfaust proves that in modern war, a cheap disposable weapon in the hands of minimally trained infantry can neutralize expensive armored vehicles crewed by professionals. December 1944, training grounds outside Liège, Belgium. Replacement tank crews arriving from the United States receive instruction that differs fundamentally from the training doctrine taught at Fort Knox 6 months earlier. The emphasis has shifted from tank versus tank engagement techniques to survival tactics against close-range infantry anti-tank weapons. Instructors who fought through France and into Germany describe combat environments where the primary threat comes not from German panzers, but from Volksgrenadiers hiding in rubble with disposable tube launchers. Sergeant Michael Brooks teaches a class on Panzerfaust recognition and evasion. Brooks survived the Aachen fighting in Harrison's company and transferred to training duties after his 3rd tank was destroyed beneath him. He shows replacement crews a captured Panzerfaust and demonstrates how quickly a soldier can fire the weapon from concealment. The demonstration uses a timer. From the moment Brooks simulates identifying a target to firing takes 4 seconds. He emphasizes that 4 seconds is insufficient time for a tank crew to identify the threat, traverse the turret, and return effective fire. Brooks' instruction focuses on prevention rather than reaction. Never enter urban terrain without infantry support. Never advance down streets without reconnaissance identifying potential firing positions. Never assume a building is clear because it appears abandoned. maintain maximum distance from any structure that could conceal enemy infantry. These lessons contradict the aggressive armored tactics that characterized American doctrine earlier in the war, but they reflect hard lessons learned through combat against an enemy who transformed cheap disposable weapons into strategic assets. Allied tactical doctrine undergoes formal revision in January 1945. Field Manual 17-33 for tank operations receives emergency updates incorporating Panzerfaust countermeasures. The updated doctrine mandates combined arms operations in all urban and restricted terrain. Tank platoons must operate with attached infantry squads trained specifically in clearing potential anti-tank positions. Artillery preparation becomes standard before armored advances into any area where German forces might establish Panzerfaust ambush positions. The doctrine changes impose significant operational costs. Combined arms coordination requires additional training, communication equipment, and time. Advances that pre-Panzerfaust doctrine projected at 5 to 10 kilometers per day in favorable terrain now proceed at 2 to 3 kilometers per day when Panzerfaust threats are present. Artillery expenditure increases by 30 to 40% as commanders order suppressive fires on potential ambush positions. Infantry casualties rise because soldiers must expose themselves to defensive fires while clearing terrain ahead of armor. British forces develop similar tactical adaptations independently. Guards Armored Division establishes specialized infantry tank teams, where specific rifle companies train exclusively with specific tank squadrons. The teams develop rehearsed procedures for urban combat. Infantry clears buildings methodically, while tanks provide covering fire from positions that minimize exposure to close-range attack. When Panzerfaust teams are identified, infantry marks their positions and withdraws while tanks engage with direct fire or artillery destroys the position before armor advances. Canadian armored units experiment with modified approach techniques in the Rhineland fighting. Tank platoons advance in echelon formations rather than column when terrain permits. This spacing prevents multiple tanks from being engaged simultaneously if a Panzerfaust team opens fire. Lead tanks carry only essential crew, driver, gunner, commander to reduce casualties if penetration occurs. Following tanks maintain 50 to 100 meter intervals and provide overwatch for lead elements. The adaptations prove effective at reducing tank losses but cannot eliminate the Panzerfaust threat entirely. German defensive tactics evolve in response to Allied countermeasures. Volksgrenadier units begin positioning Panzerfaust teams in mutually supporting positions where infantry clearing one position exposes itself to fire from adjacent positions. Some German units employ decoy positions to draw Allied attention, while actual firing positions remain concealed until tanks enter optimal engagement range. Harrison's company participates in the February 1945 assault on the Siegfried Line fortifications near Düren. The operation demonstrates both the effectiveness of adapted tactics and the continuing danger Panzerfausts pose to armored operations. Harrison's tanks advance with infantry from the 9th Infantry Division, clearing pillboxes and bunker complexes ahead of the armor. The coordination is precise. Infantry marks cleared positions with colored smoke. Tanks advance only after receiving all clear signals from infantry commanders. Despite these precautions, Harrison loses 2 tanks to Panzerfaust attacks during the 4-day operation. Both losses occur when German infiltration teams bypass American infantry positions during darkness. and establish new firing positions in terrain already cleared and marked as secure. The first attack destroys a Sherman that had been stationary for 3 hours in what was believed to be a safe position. The second attack targets a tank moving between cleared positions along a route infantry had certified as secure. The incidents illustrate a fundamental limitation of Allied countermeasures. Clearing terrain is temporary. German forces continuously re-infiltrate positions using small teams carrying Panzerfausts. Static defense and mobile defense merge into fluid combat where no position remains secure for more than a few hours. Allied forces must continuously re-clear terrain or accept that tanks operating in previously secured areas remain vulnerable to Panzerfaust attacks from positions established after initial clearing operations. Supply considerations add additional complexity to Panzerfaust countermeasures. Allied armored divisions advancing into Germany operate at the end of supply lines stretching back to channel ports. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts must be transported hundreds of kilometers. The logistical infrastructure supports rapid mobile operations when resistance is light. But Panzerfaust-imposed tactical changes reduce advance rates and increase artillery consumption, straining supply networks designed for different operational tempos. Harrison's company requires 40% more high-explosive ammunition in early 1945 compared to September 1944 because tanks now engage suspected Panzerfaust positions with direct fire rather than bypassing them. Infantry units supporting armor require additional small arms ammunition because building clearing operations consume ammunition at rates exceeding normal infantry combat. Medical evacuation assets face increased demands because infantry clearing operations generate higher casualty rates than mobile warfare. German production of Panzerfausts continues even as Allied strategic bombing devastates other sectors of German industry. The weapon's manufacturing simplicity makes it resistant to industrial disruption. Factories producing Panzerfausts require minimal specialized equipment. Stamping presses, welding equipment, and explosive filling stations can be established in dispersed facilities that present difficult targets for Allied bombers. British intelligence estimates German production capacity in early 1945 at over 300,000 Panzerfausts per month, despite sustained bombing of German industrial centers. The distribution networks prove equally resilient. Panzerfausts move through German logistics systems as individual items rather than requiring specialized transport or handling. A single truck can carry hundreds of the weapons. Storage requires minimal space and no special facilities. Wehrmacht logistics disperses Panzerfausts throughout defensive positions in quantities that ensure every infantry squad maintains constant access to multiple weapons regardless of supply line disruptions. Allied intelligence interrogates German factory workers captured near Essen and learns details about Panzerfaust production that explain its remarkable scalability. The weapon contains no components requiring precision machining. Every part can be produced using basic metalworking equipment available in machine shops throughout Germany. The shaped charge warhead uses commercial explosives and requires no specialized manufacturing beyond careful filling and assembly. A medium-sized factory with 200 workers can produce 5,000 Panzerfausts monthly. The economic model underlying Panzerfaust production represents a strategic insight that Allied planners initially failed to recognize. Germany cannot match Allied tank production. German industry produced approximately 6,000 Panzers and assault guns in 1944, while American factories produced over 17,000 tanks. But Germany does not need to match Allied tank production if it can produce anti-tank weapons at ratios of 100 Panzerfausts for every Allied tank. Harrison receives promotion to captain in March 1945 and assumes command of a tank company in the 3rd Armored Division, preparing for Rhine crossing operations. His new command includes 17 Shermans and attached infantry from the 104th Infantry Division. Harrison's first task is implementing the combined arms doctrine that emerged from 6 months of combat against Panzerfaust-equipped defenders. The training emphasizes procedures Harrison's previous company developed through trial and error in Aachen. Infantry and armor rehearse coordination until tank commanders and rifle platoon leaders can communicate effectively under combat conditions. Infantry learns tank capabilities and limitations. Tank crews learn infantry tactics and understand how rifle squads clear buildings and suppress anti-tank positions. The training requires 2 weeks of intensive preparation before the unit achieves the coordination necessary for effective operations against Panzerfaust threats. Allied armored forces crossing the Rhine in late March employ tactical procedures fundamentally different from those used during the Normandy breakout 9 months earlier. Armor no longer operates as independent spearheads racing ahead of infantry support. Every tank advance requires infantry clearing operations. Every urban area demands methodical building-by-building suppression of potential Panzerfaust positions. The operational tempo reflects lessons purchased through hundreds of destroyed tanks and thousands of casualties. The Rhine crossing operations demonstrate both the success of adapted tactics and the continuing effectiveness of Panzerfaust defenses. Allied tank losses per kilometer advanced decrease by approximately 60% compared to fall 1944 operations. But German defenders still inflict significant casualties on Allied armor despite declining overall Wehrmacht combat effectiveness. Volksgrenadier units with adequate Panzerfaust supplies can delay Allied advances and destroy individual tanks even when surrounded and cut off from higher headquarters. Harrison's company fights through the Ruhr pocket in April, encountering German resistance that varies wildly in quality and equipment, but maintains consistent access to Panzerfausts. Some Wehrmacht units have no working artillery, limited small arms ammunition, and inadequate rations. But those same units possess stockpiles of Panzerfausts sufficient to engage Allied armor throughout days of continuous combat. The pattern confirms intelligence assessments that German logistics prioritize Panzerfaust distribution even as other supplies became critically scarce. Individual engagements illustrate the continuing danger. Harrison's lead tank encounters a German roadblock defended by 12 Volksgrenadiers armed with rifles and 4 Panzerfausts. American infantry clears the position in a 20-minute firefight. The Germans fire all 4 Panzerfausts during the engagement. 2 miss. One hits a Sherman's turret at an angle that causes deflection. One penetrates a Sherman's hull and kills 3 crew members. The engagement cost ratio, 1 Allied tank damaged and 3 soldiers killed to eliminate 12 German defenders, reflects tactical realities even after months of adaptation and training. May 1945. The war in Europe ends with German forces collapsing across all fronts. Allied armored divisions that fought from Normandy to the Elbe River compile final after-action reports documenting 6 months of operations against Panzerfaust-equipped defenders. The statistics reveal patterns that transform post-war analysis of armored warfare economics and tactical doctrine. American armored divisions operating in Northwest Europe from September 1944 through May 1945 lost approximately 2,300 tanks to all causes. Intelligence analysis attributes roughly 900 of those losses directly to Panzerfaust attacks. British Second Army reports similar proportions. Canadian armored units document even higher percentages in operations through the Netherlands, where urban combat predominated and Panzerfaust effectiveness reached maximum levels. Harrison survives the war with his 4th Tank Company intact. His personal experience spans 3 destroyed Shermans beneath him and command responsibility for 41 tanks lost to various causes, including 18 confirmed Panzerfaust kills. He returns to the United States in June 1945 and participates in debriefings where Army intelligence officers compile lessons learned for post-war doctrine development. The questions Harrison faces during debriefing focus on economic and tactical aspects of Panzerfaust encounters. How many tanks could have been saved through different tactics? What training modifications would have prepared crews more effectively? What technological countermeasures might reduce Panzerfaust effectiveness? Harrison's answers reflect the consensus emerging from hundreds of similar debriefings. The Panzerfaust represented a weapon system that could not be completely countered through tactics, training, or available technology, because its fundamental design exploited inherent vulnerabilities in armored warfare. German records captured after the war provide comprehensive production data that confirms Allied intelligence estimates. Total Panzerfaust production from 1943 through May 1945 exceeded 6 million units. The weapon existed in several variants, with different warhead sizes and ranges, but all shared the same basic characteristics: disposable, single-shot, shaped charge anti-tank weapons optimized for mass production and minimum training requirements. 6 million Panzerfausts distributed across German defensive positions from France to Poland. The scale of production dwarfs every other anti-tank weapon system deployed by any nation during the war. Soviet anti-tank rifle production totaled approximately 300,000 units. American bazooka production reached approximately 500,000 units. German production of conventional anti-tank guns of all types combined totaled less than 200,000 units. The Panzerfaust alone exceeded all these numbers combined. The cost analysis confirms what Harrison and thousands of other tank commanders learned through combat experience. German expenditure on Panzerfaust production totaled approximately 180 million Reichsmarks, based on the 30 Reichsmark unit cost. Allied tank losses attributable to Panzerfausts represented approximately 45,000 destroyed or damaged vehicles valued at over $2 billion in Allied manufacturing costs. The exchange ratio approached 11-1 in Germany's favor when measuring defensive expenditure against offensive losses. Post-war military analysis examines why Allied intelligence failed to recognize the Panzerfaust threat before it became operationally significant. Several factors contributed to the intelligence failure. First, the weapon's extreme simplicity made it appear improvised and ineffective compared to sophisticated German engineering in other weapon systems. Analysts assumed Germany would prioritize quality over quantity in anti-tank weapons, as it had in tank and artillery production. Second, Allied intelligence focused on tracking German tank production and heavy anti-tank gun deployment because those systems had proven most dangerous during earlier campaigns. The analytical framework did not account for the possibility that Germany might compensate for declining production of complex weapons by mass-producing simple but effective alternatives. Third, early combat reports describing Panzerfaust encounters reached intelligence headquarters without adequate context about production scale and distribution. Individual tank losses to the weapon appeared as isolated incidents rather than indicators of systematic German anti-tank capability. Only when losses accumulated across multiple divisions did the pattern become clear enough to trigger doctrinal responses. The strategic implications of Panzerfaust's effectiveness extend beyond immediate combat results. German defensive success with cheap disposable anti-tank weapons demonstrated that technological inferiority could be offset through intelligent weapon design and mass production. A nation losing the industrial production race could still impose disproportionate costs on technologically superior opponents by identifying and exploiting tactical vulnerabilities. Allied post-war armor doctrine incorporates lessons from Panzerfaust encounters into fundamental training and operational planning. The United States Army Armor School at Fort Knox establishes mandatory instruction in urban combat techniques, emphasizing infantry armor coordination against close-range anti-tank threats. British armored forces adopt permanent combined arms organization where tank units maintain organic infantry elements trained specifically for clearing operations. The tactical adaptations developed against Panzerfausts influence Cold War armored doctrine when potential opponents include Soviet forces expected to employ similar weapons in even greater quantities. American and NATO planning assumes Soviet infantry will possess disposable anti-tank weapons comparable to or exceeding Panzerfaust capabilities. The expectation shapes everything from tank design to tactical training to operational planning for armored operations in Central Europe. Tank development programs initiated in 1945 and continuing through the 1950s incorporate specific features intended to reduce vulnerability to shaped charge weapons. Increased armor thickness provides limited protection. Standoff armor creates separation between outer hull surfaces and main armor to disrupt shaped charge jet formation. Eventually, reactive armor systems emerge that detonate explosive panels when hit by shaped charge warheads to disperse penetrating jets before they reach main armor. But the fundamental vulnerability remains. Tanks operating in urban terrain or restricted approaches will always face threats from infantry armed with portable shaped charge weapons. The economics continue to favor defenders. Modern anti-tank weapons cost thousands of dollars compared to tanks costing millions. The ratio is less extreme than Panzerfaust versus Sherman, but the basic principle endures. Relatively cheap infantry weapons can destroy expensive armored vehicles when employed effectively from close range. Harrison retires from the Army in 1946 and spends 30 years working in industrial production management. His wartime experience with Panzerfausts influences his perspective on manufacturing economics and weapon system design. In later interviews, Harrison describes the Panzerfaust as the most strategically significant weapon he encountered during the war, not because of its technological sophistication, but because it demonstrated how ruthless simplification and mass production could offset industrial disadvantages. The specific example Harrison references repeatedly involves cost comparisons. America produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war, at costs averaging $50,000 per vehicle. Total American investment in Sherman production exceeded $2 billion. Germany produced 6 million Panzerfausts at costs totaling roughly 180 million Reichsmarks, or approximately $72 million. If even 10% of those Panzerfausts destroyed or damaged Allied tanks, the German investment achieved returns exceeding 10 to 1 in eliminated enemy combat power versus production costs. German military archives examined after reunification provide additional insights into Panzerfaust development and deployment decisions. The weapon originated not from desperation, but from deliberate analysis of anti-tank warfare economics. German ordnance officers in 1942 recognized that Wehrmacht tank production could not match combined Allied and Soviet output. Rather than attempting impossible production goals, German planners invested in weapons that could destroy enemy tanks at minimal cost. The Panzerfaust design deliberately sacrificed range, accuracy, and reusability to achieve maximum production efficiency. A weapon that could be manufactured in small workshops using unskilled labor and minimal materials. A weapon that required almost no training to employ effectively. A weapon simple enough that production could continue even as strategic bombing devastated German industry. The design philosophy represented strategic realism, accepting technological limitations while exploiting manufacturing advantages. Soviet forces captured hundreds of thousands of Panzerfausts during the final months of the war and evaluated the weapon extensively for potential adoption. Soviet analysis reached conclusions similar to Allied assessments. The Panzerfaust demonstrated that shaped charge technology and disposable launchers provided cost-effective anti-tank capability accessible to minimally trained infantry. Post-war Soviet anti-tank weapons, including the RPG series, incorporated design principles derived partly from Panzerfaust analysis. The weapon's influence extends beyond military applications into broader strategic thinking about asymmetric warfare and economic force multiplication. Military theorists studying conflicts where technologically inferior forces confronted superior opponents identify the Panzerfaust as an early example of deliberate capability asymmetry, choosing to compete in areas where relative advantages could be maximized rather than attempting to match opponent strengths directly. Harrison's final tank company musters out in Germany in June 1945. Of the 17 Shermans that crossed the Rhine in March, 9 remain operational at war's end. 5 were destroyed by Panzerfausts in the final 6 weeks of combat. 2 were lost to mines. 1 suffered mechanical failure and was abandoned during rapid advances in late April. The casualty statistics for Harrison's company reflect broader patterns. Panzerfausts remained a primary threat to Allied armor through the final days of the European War. Statistical analysis compiled by U.S. Army historians documents that Panzerfaust effectiveness actually increased in early 1945 despite improved Allied tactics and countermeasures. Several factors explain this trend. German forces concentrated in progressively smaller defensive perimeters, where terrain favored close-range anti-tank engagement. Allied advances into Germany encountered more urban combat than operations in France. Wehrmacht units fighting on German soil demonstrated higher motivation and more aggressive anti-tank tactics than forces retreating through occupied territories. The economic data becomes even more striking when examining costs per kill. Allied tank losses to Panzerfausts averaged approximately $12 in German manufacturing costs per tank destroyed or seriously damaged. No other weapon system in military history achieved comparable cost-exchange ratios. German 88mm anti-tank guns cost thousands of Reichsmarks to manufacture and required trained crews and prime movers. Panther and Tiger tanks cost hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks and consumed fuel and spare parts that German logistics could barely sustain. The Panzerfaust cost 30 Reichsmarks and required one minimally trained soldier. Harrison lives until 1989 and witnesses the evolution of anti-tank warfare through 4 decades of Cold War military development. He watches as Soviet RPG-7s employed by guerrilla forces destroy American tanks in Vietnam. He observes how portable anti-tank guided missiles transform Middle East conflicts. He sees the continuing validity of the lesson the Panzerfaust taught, that expensive armored vehicles remain vulnerable to cheap infantry weapons when tactical conditions permit close engagement. In his final interview, Harrison describes the Panzerfaust as a weapon that changed his understanding of military power fundamentally. Before encountering it, Harrison believed American industrial superiority made Allied victory inevitable. The Sherman might be inferior to the Panther or Tiger in direct combat, but American factories produced 10 Shermans for every German heavy tank. The arithmetic seemed conclusive and irrefutable. The Panzerfaust challenged that arithmetic by changing the terms of the equation entirely. Germany could not win the production race for tanks, artillery, or aircraft, but Germany could produce millions of weapons that turned every infantry soldier into a tank killer. The cost exchange was so favorable that Wehrmacht forces could destroy Allied armor faster than American factories could replace it, if Panzerfausts were employed effectively across all defensive positions. Germany ultimately lost the war because industrial capacity, strategic resources, and demographic advantages favored the Allies too heavily for any weapon system to offset completely. But the Panzerfaust demonstrated that even losing powers could impose disproportionate costs through intelligent weapon design. The principle remains relevant in every asymmetric conflict where technologically inferior forces identify tactical vulnerabilities in superior opponents and exploit those vulnerabilities with weapons optimized for specific purposes rather than general excellence. The legacy endures in modern military doctrine and weapon development. Every Army training tank cruise emphasizes urban combat techniques derived from World War II experience against Panzerfausts. Every tank design incorporates protective measures intended to defeat shaped charge weapons, traced conceptually to the Panzerfaust threat. Every analysis of armored warfare economics references the cost ratios the Panzerfaust achieved and the strategic implications of cheap, effective weapons versus expensive platforms. Harrison's war ended in May 1945. His education about the relationship between cost, effectiveness, and strategic impact continued for the rest of his life. The crude metal tube that German factory workers assembled for 30 Reichsmarks proved more strategically significant than the sophisticated tanks American industry produced for $50,000. Not because the Panzerfaust was a better weapon in any absolute sense, but because it was the right weapon for Germany's strategic situation. Cheap enough to produce in millions, simple enough to require minimal training, effective enough to threaten any Allied tank, and distributed widely enough to appear wherever Allied armor advanced. 6 million Panzerfausts. The number represents Germany's answer to American industrial might. Not better tanks, not more tanks, just millions of disposable weapons that turned the economic calculation of armored warfare upside down and taught a generation of soldiers that sometimes the crudest solution is the most effective.